Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to yet another edition of the Lambom Show. Today is Wednesday, August 17th, 2022, and we are continuing our series on the new US Africa strategy that was released last week. I'm sorry that we are starting off late. I had some technical issues, but I'm glad that we have two very great personalities that are going to lead us, give us their opinions, the analysis of the strategy. With me on set this evening, we have um, Mahder Habtemariam, recently graduated from Pan with a MA degree in Pan African Studies, and is currently enrolled in political science, doing a PhD at Syracuse University. Her research has explored the 2019 Sudanese uprising and the fundamental role of women to the liberation struggles with radical possibilities. Her current research interests include African social and women's movements, grassroots mobilization, political organization, and African transformational politics. Mahder was born and raised in Ethiopia and lived in Malaysia before residing in the United States. She has worked with research institutions and women's organizations in Ethiopia. She is currently serving as a board member of the Africa Initiative and as president of the African Graduate Students Network. She is proud to serve as vice chairperson of the Global Pan-African Movement, the North American delegation. Thank you very much, Nai, and thank you for accepting to be part of this program.
Thank you for having me, Lambert.
The next is Bo. Bo has extensive experience as a public policy and public engagement advisor with stakeholders and elected officials at the local, state, and federal level. He has worked on a wide range of domestic and foreign policy issues, particularly relating to the economy, climate, and Africa. He has successfully passed legislation, formed coalitions, and accomplished organizational goals throughout his career. Bo graduated from Wake Forest University with degrees in economics and international affairs and a master's in public administration with honors distinction at George Mason University. Inspired by his background as a first-generation Ugandan Kenyan American, he has worked to serve his community through a nonprofit he co-founded called Global Inheritance. And I'm sure there's more to this than all that we have all said, but let's start off and just find out. Hey, Bo, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Lambert. It's good to be on.
So let's start off the conversations. You are in public policy space. So what has been your evaluation of the document, the strategy document that was released last week? Let's start off with Bo.
Hey, thanks again for having me on, Lambert. It's good to be on and talking about U.S. Africa strategy. That's definitely been the talk around DC and a lot of the African diaspora community, as well as just to do an analysis to see what opportunities there could be in a U.S. Africa strategy. I think the greatest opportunity, as you've seen, Secretary Blinken, this is his second trip to the continent. Ambassador Lyndon Thomas Greenfield also made a trip a couple days before to some other countries. I think the greatest opportunity that we actually have in this U.S. Africa strategy is to have, which was a small part of the strategy that they released, is to have a diaspora engagement. In my home state of Virginia, the diaspora is actually the fastest growing immigrant community in Virginia. In the United States, first gen or foreign-born Africans who are now citizens of the U.S. reach up to 2 million, and that's not including first-generation folks with parents who were born there and then born here, like myself, or second or third generation African diaspora as well. And I think really the Biden-Harris team and this administration have the opportunity to really engage the diaspora in a way that hasn't been engaged before, to inform their policies, to inform ways that U.S. and Africa ultimately have a shared partnership and a mutually beneficial one as well. I think it's not only good for our policy, our domestic policy, but it's also good for our foreign policy as well to be actually engaging these constituencies in the diaspora and to really have them at the centerpiece and lead on that. And so hopefully as we build up to this Africa Leader Summit, you'll see a concerted effort from the administration to engage the diaspora across the country to make sure that they're informing the policy, the U.S. Africa policy, so it can actually be effective in ways that I don't think Democrats or Republicans have seen in the past.
So thank you very much. I'm glad you mentioned that role of the diaspora as something new that we have found in that strategy, and I think it's critically important for the diaspora itself to show up. Last week we talked about it in terms of during the presidential elections, there was the ton of excitement that we had here in terms of African immigrants engaging that process is something that needs to be translated into, and I think that strategy that they've developed is great. Mahi, you are currently in Dakar, Senegal, so you are on the continent. What has been your take of the document and how has it been received?
Thanks once again, Lambert and Bo. Good to be here with both of you. So, I mean, when it comes to this strategy, I must start with the clear title, right? It's called the Sub-Saharan Strategy. So, I think that's very important in a sense. Like this terminology not only reinforces like a so-called division between North Africa and other African countries, but it really has no geographic or cultural basis. Rather, like it is based on the racist attempt to craft North Africans as different from what is considered Black Africa. So if it was truly about the Sahara and not race, countries like Mauritania would be counted as sub-Saharan, as because its capital, like most of the country, is hardly south of the Sahara. So despite having many African scholars having explained the arbitrary nature and racist aspect of this terminology, and without really explaining why North African countries required a different strategy, the decision of the title from the outset shows me that the mutual respect reference in the strategy is doubtful. And secondly, I think the strategy itself shows the current importance of Africa. Really, like it has reached a point where Africa's position in the world cannot be denied by any actor. So whether it's the population and it's like short population within the continent and outside, like Bo has mentioned, or whether it's resources from land to minerals and human capital. But overall, we see that the US having to put out this strategy and really what it has included in the strategy shows the days where Africa is seen as an appendage of a certain part of the world is over. So I'll stop there.
So again, that's interesting because you mentioned the fact that the relating it just to sub-Saharan Africa is perpetuating a narrative that is kind of false about the relationship of Africa in general. But I think again, relative to how international relations have been, would you have preferred just a U.S. Africa strategy other than a U.S. sub-Saharan Africa strategy? And is that not taking out from the balance of power that we have currently in the world? Right.
Can you hear me, Lambert?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I mean, definitely I would have preferred a US Africa strategy because, like I mentioned, like this separation, of course, there are historical realities and there are considering, like many people use, for example, the fact that sub Saharan Africa makes sense because North African countries with a larger Arab population have a certain cultural and a linguistic similarity that cannot be said about other parts of the continent. But the really like then why do we not really relate to the Kiswahili speaking population in East Africa, which can be connected to the Arab traders? Why don't we refer to Indonesia as part of the Middle East? Like why don't we refer to Brazil as like part of Africa because it has a large, African population? So these are things when it comes to Africa, though, this is a statement, a terminology that has been normalized and is not questioned, despite many African scholars haven't said that it is arbitrary and it is racist. The term sub itself has connotations. I mean, if we're looking at the geographic, it's not beneath the Sahara, and the countries included are not beneath it. What is really the point in creating or using this and perpetuating divisions that have not benefited the continent for a very long time? And I do not see, in fact, I see this working against the geopolitics of Africa and any possibilities of like strengthening African solidarity with one another.
Great. So, Bo, again, I don't know your take. You have any comment with respect to that? But on a different note, the strategy seems to be focused more on the U.S. combating Russia and China, and really not celebrating, in its sense, Africa as Africa. So, if African countries did not take up initiatives with China and Russia, maybe the strategy would not have been as strong as it is. So it seems as if Africa is being used as a leverage to fight Russia and China, when it should actually be Africa for Africa's sake, beyond just its connections to this. What's your comment on that?
Hey, so yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's evident that this strategy came following a trip from the equivalent of the Secretary of State and the Foreign Minister in Russia to Sub-Saharan Africa. China has also been investing in Africa extensively through the China Belt and Road Initiative. And I don't, and African countries, I think, as have seen that investment help the country, whereas in the U.S. has fallen behind in terms of that investment. So I think that it is an attempt from the Biden administration to refocus, and at the end of their strategy say, this is, what we've done previously hasn't necessarily paid the dividends that we thought it would, and this is how we relate to a 21st century Africa strategy. So I do think that is a step in the right direction. Having said that, this strategy, without funding, without the diaspora engaged, I think will also not see the fruit that I think that is intended. To me, I think that the diaspora is the most underutilized community and constituency when it comes to how the U.S. can effectively engage U.S.-Africa policy. When you talk to lawmakers about how to form U.S. South America policy, they engage the Latino community, and rightfully so. When it's U.S. India policy, they engage the Indian community and the AAPI community at large when they're looking at what to do in the Indo-Pacific. And so my hope is that as this strategy takes many different iterations, that the diaspora is really engaged at the forefront of whatever policy it is, because we know that African countries, they do have a comparative advantage when it comes to rare earth minerals, when it comes to the population that not only exists today, but that will exist in 2050. And so 25% of the world's population will be in Africa. And I think that that's something that many countries across the world recognize and are trying to figure out ways to partner with folks on the continent to be able to address some of what their needs are domestically, but also to create allies internationally. I think that Africa is a prime, the continent is prime, and there's 54, and to Mahi's point, there are many references in the U.S.-Africa strategy to the AU, which is not just sub-Saharan Africa, but it contains all 54 countries in Africa. And so there should be engagement throughout in each country. To my knowledge, will be invited to the Africa Leader Summit in December of this year, and I think that that's going to be strategically important to make sure that we're all engaging from a country-to-country strategy, not just looking at the continent as a whole as well.
So, I mean, How do you define African diaspora? Because again, generally there's been a tendency to include African Americans as part of the African diaspora, and I think that when it comes to the policy space in DC, you seem to see the African Americans as the African diaspora. Those of us who actually came over recently from the continent, we have time for other things. The African diaspora is not that engaged as much as African Americans. So, what is your definition of African diaspora?
So I'd push back on the African diaspora not being as engaged in this. I'll give you an example. In my home state of in Virginia, both Senators Tim Kaine and Senator Mark Warner are very engaged with the diaspora. You see that the Washington Post reported during this past gubernatorial election that the Ethiopian diaspora was not supportive of the way that the Biden administration was handling U.S. Ethiopia relations, whether that be removal of AGOA, whether that be the way that they're interacting with the prime minister. And so you saw a pushback, not only on policy, but also on politically, where the diaspora wasn't engaging in record numbers actually voted for Governor Youngkin to become the next governor. And I do think that that is indicative of the not only the organization that the diaspora is having across the country, both politically but also foreign policy. We talk a lot about one issue voters, and we talk about a lot about what are kitchen table issues. Well, for the diaspora, oftentimes those are what's happening in their foreign-born countries or the countries that they're connected to on the continent. We actually do more. The African diaspora sends more in remittances, which are money that go back to their home state, than the U.S. actually invests in foreign assistance on the continent of Africa. And so there's not only an economic importance to the continent from the African diaspora, but there's also a unique connection where folks here in the U.S. are keenly aware of what's happening in their continent, oftentimes better than folks who have historically been in this space. And so that's, I think, the unique advantage and the comparative advantage actually the U.S. has that may have not been realized to its fullest potential so far. But I think the strategy does touch on it a little bit. And finally, I'll say this. I think that there is, in the way that I look at the diaspora is, you have your foreign-born population, which I talked about, kind of the 11% of the new immigrants who are coming into Virginia, and the fastest-growing immigrant population is foreign-born African folks. So, take for example, my mom, born in Uganda, comes here and does that. That is just those. So when you talk about the next generation, like myself, mom is born and raised in Uganda, moves here. My dad, born and raised in Kenya, moves here. I'm a first generation American. And so, I think the definitions kind of vary. The way I look at it is at least up to the second generation of those African diaspora communities is kind of where that remittances kind of in cultural and economic and cultural aspect really are highlighted. But then also, the enslaved folks and the transatlantic slave movement that came from West Africa to the United States is something that, from a cultural perspective and also a racial perspective, is something that definitely should be highlighted as well. The first enslaved people in this country actually landed here in Virginia, and so that from a engagement standpoint, you see a lot of folks, particularly in the larger African American community, really for many different reasons wanting to engage back into the continent. And so, but when you talk about I think that there are different levels to that. But when I'm talking about diaspora for this conversation, what I'm definitely talking about is foreign-born, first-gen and second-gen African diasporas is what the definition that I'm using right now.
Thank you for that. And again, it's also to say that the Ethiopian diaspora is one of the most active, best organized that I know of in this area. That is at least the temptation is always to do a blanket thing. But for Brazil said there, I think that the diaspora is on transit. African Americans are permanent. Diaspora is on the move, participating in their home state. He's explaining it very well. So that's somebody in the audience who is commenting about yours. But again, so Mahi, so let's get back to you and find out, is there anything you loved so much about that document? Is there one thing that you can pick out to say this is something that I really loved about the document?
That is a tough question, Lambert. Honestly, there is nothing I love about the document, but like you've mentioned earlier, and like I kind of started this conversation with, I think what's very important about the document, and particularly the release of the document during this period, is the fact that it shows that the world is in flux and is undergoing this rupture, and that Africa is at the center of how the future of the world will be determined. And so my favorite thing is that many of what we see within the strategy itself was a response, whether, like you said, it's the organizing of diasporas within the US, whether it's the permanent forum in the UN, which is mentioned in the strategy, whether it is this partnership that African countries have had with Russia and China. It is all just a response to the kind of move Africa has been making. So I think my favorite thing about the strategy is the fact that the U.S. now has publicly admitted that there is a need to engage in this, whatever they call, mutual respect kind of step towards engaging with African countries. But not necessarily anything I have read stands out to me. In fact, I think much of what was in the strategy comes off very incoherent, at times paternalistic, and at times misunderstood.
That that's a sad sad way, but I'm glad that you're able to again just lay that out as it is. I mean, I agree in large part with that, especially in the fact of it being paternalistic. Bo just mentioned there the fact that 25% of the world's population is going to be in Africa, isn't it? And yet they are treating us as if we are here, we are just here to beg and to depend on the US. And now let's take it one step further. Looking beyond, you have been in Africa, I don't know how long, for a couple of weeks. There are things that you have noticed, and let's get it to what is current. Kenya just had elections, and again, it seems as if we are going to go down the path they went 10 years ago, isn't it? Because elections are being challenged. And I think that the document is kind of heavy on the political side with respect to open societies, having democratic societies. And we know that in its recent past, America has not given us that example, especially with the last election. So they don't have any leverage to be able to talk to the Africans. Last week, the person I had on said, you know, there's not too much that the US can offer to Africa on the political platform. And I'm wondering whether, looking at it currently, what do you think the US can offer to Africans in terms of democracy that they seem to be preaching throughout the document?
Um, I think, Lambert, what the U.S. can offer is, first of all, a democratic kind of institution and governance within its own country, right? Within the African diaspora, which includes, like, based on the strategy itself, African Americans that can trace their heritage back into enslavement, or just Black people in general. So I think the best thing the U.S. can do for us is, first of all, police brutality. Make sure that Black people's lives in the U.S. are not threatened daily. So make sure that voting rights, which have been on a huge rollback ever since, and I think we're seeing it over primaries, that these issues within the US, that Black people, African diaspora are really recognized and validated within the state structures, not just represented, but really like what is happening within African American communities, what is happening within indigenous communities. So I think the best thing the US can do is really like internally ask itself these questions, and then maybe then, with example, we can follow suit. And I just want to add, I think at this stage, because the strategy does talk about supporting democracy, supporting civil society, like I think Africa should be asking if we want to adopt the liberal form of democracy that has barely benefited marginalized groups in the US itself, let alone African countries. And, like you have scholars like Claude Eke, Issa Shivji, and they've interrogated the premises and historical emergence of liberal democracy and why it has not served to democratize African societies. So, what does it mean to and this is a quote, to back civil society and empower marginalized groups? So, my question is is the U.S. prepared to support the living and working conditions of people, to support marginalized groups in attaining food and water and electricity? Like, what will it mean to really back these groups? Because to me, democracy on the continent should start from that basic truth, that our people's democracy isn't really going to be attained by multi-party elections and this although I do support elections, but I think that our concern as Africans should not be imitating this form of democracy the US has been preaching for decades in Africa and has really not brought any substantial changes to the continent.
Are you suggesting that there's an African democracy that should be, and what form would that take beyond what we currently have? When you talk about a liberal democracy, what form do you anticipate? And to the point of last week's session, the point about U.S. props up dictators in Africa. There are at least 4 or 5 of them in African countries to which the U.S. continues to send aid. So you want democracy for the masses and dictatorship for a few people over the very masses that you're preaching democracy. I think they are preaching to the choir. But again, what form of democracy would you propose for the US to be able to, support in Africa? And I get your point. I get your point about, hey, when you come preaching democracy to people who are hungry, they need water and all that, it seems as if you are putting the cart before the horse.
So, I mean, in the US context, democracy would be like, where is the democracy for all the marginalized groups, like the immigrants, the Haitians being deported, the African Americans and the Africans being killed on the streets? Where is democracy for them? The voting rights that have been being affected ever since Donald Trump was in office, all these rollbacks, where is that democracy? And then in the context of this African democracy you speak of, really, and also because my work is on Sudan, is like, what we are seeing right now in Sudan is these forms and structures of organizing that involve popular participation, right? And a building of popular power. Ever since 2019 and the removal of Omar al-Bashir, the Sudanese people have really been able to build horizontal structures, autonomous structures that have gotten better at involving a participatory process of people in politics. But once again, the US has been very hesitant. I think maybe this last year that has changed its rhetoric to support and perhaps sanction some of the military regimes, the individuals in the military regime in Sudan. But really, for the longest time, it's been putting out statements with Saudi Arabia, like the very forces that are supporting the military regime in Sudan, that are repressing any source of new forms and alternate forms of political organizing. But when I imagine African democracy and how it will be organized, it will be horizontal, it will be very participatory, and it will not be vested in the hands of a few that has really not served any of us.
That's an interesting proposition and something that we need to look forward to. But Bo, let's. I mean, you have been in the political space. Something that we didn't mention at the beginning, isn't it? You worked with the senator.
So yeah. I mean, I'll say this. The United States, it's not perfect by any means necessary. I think that if you've lived in this country, it's not perfect, but it does strive to be a more perfect union. And I think that the United States does have a role to play in democracy domestically, as well domestically first. I'll say that to make sure that all groups, all marginalized groups, all groups in general, are participate in what we call this democracy and republic at the same time. And so, from that perspective, the United States is always trying to grow into a more perfect union. And so, to that, I think that there should be some level, there should be appreciation for that. I'll say when it comes to the U.S. Africa strategy, in particular, one of the things that from my perspective after reading the document is really it's going to be imperative for the U.S. When it looks to partner with African countries to find areas of mutual interest. I think that's something that we haven't really fully realized yet, and a lot of that has to do with to go back and I to beat this over a drum, or however the saying goes, is that the diaspora has an economic is built in with an economic focus on Africa, and so the U.S. should really look at finding out ways where they can empower the economies of scale, provide jobs, work with figuring out how to make the banking systems easier between the U.S. and different African countries. Focus in on bilateral trade deals, like the one that was started during the past administration, the U.S.-Kenya trade deal, because in looking at what comes after AGOA, which is something that wasn't mentioned in the Africa strategy, but I know that Congress is working on that right now. A couple of weeks ago, Ambassador Tai, the head of USTR, said that they're moving forward on a framework to implement a U.S.-Kenya trade deal, which I think would be good for would be a good model for how we do bilateral deals in between the U.S. and different African countries. Second, I think that there's an interesting point to be made around the way that we look at African countries. There are a lot of nuances that need to definitely be discussed and talked about when it comes to partnering with African countries. But those nuances don't prevent the U.S. from also engaging with other different countries. We have deals and negotiated and have worked on the global stage with China before. The same with India. The same with Russia at a point in time, and the same with a lot of other countries. Yet we have found areas of mutual interest and mutual benefited interest where I think the same thing could be afforded to African countries. I think what we do sometimes with Africa, and in my opinion, too often, unfortunately, too much, is say that we have to like this particular leader. Otherwise, we can't engage with this country. Everything has to be exactly perfect when it comes to how this country performs democracy or whatnot. If we cannot hold ourselves to the same standard, it's really hard to be able to hold standards of different emerging markets to that same standard, which I think actually prevents us from doing that. Mike talked about Sudan. I was able to be working in Washington D.C. and in Congress around the time where the U.S. and Sudan worked on how to reestablish our relationships through the Abraham Accords, and that was a monumental piece of legislation. It removed sanctions from Sudan and allowed for there to be actual dialogue for the first time between folks within the Middle East and Africa and the United States at a time where I think that was a very that policy was something that folks said maybe couldn't have been done. Since then, sometimes the U.S. does act on kind of a sanctions type of thing, and so we go around and we don't actually, sometimes we don't acknowledge some of the geopolitical natures of some of these strategically important countries, and how our economic partnership could actually lead to the civil society that we're looking to see. And I think that when we do that, I mean, Sudan is a strategic country. It's got the port of the Red Sea. We've got Ethiopia, has some of the same some of the same goals of what we are looking to do in terms of creating a clean energy economy through their process of the GERD. And I think some of those things we need to be able to work with these African countries to say, here are ways that we can partner, and ultimately we will see some of those wins from a civil society perspective that I think that we're looking to see. And then the last thing that I want to say is that we've seen the U.S. Kenya elections, and we saw support from across East Africa and across the continent congratulating President-elect Ruto of winning. And I think that actually is something that's very positive when it comes to the African continent. About this is a new leader, young. He's in his 50s, and it's for the first time you're seeing a political shift and dynamic, and a huge portion of, although it was a close election, a huge portion of folks in Kenya looking to embrace this new this new form of this new leadership in their democracy. And I think that whether it's from President Museveni in Uganda, or folks in the president of Burundi, or the president of Tanzania, seeing that, or Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia, really kind of coming together, saying congratulations, I think is a way to show that there is a unity that is taking place in Africa, that shouldn't be overlooked when we're talking about U.S. Africa policy. And actually, in my opinion, it should be encouraged to that. And I think that oftentimes we focus so much on what's wrong. We don't actually talk a lot about what's going right on the continent. Take Uganda for instance. Most cabinet officials and most people in parliament are women. You can't say that about the United States. And oftentimes those great highlights of things that are happening that have come because of economic investment in country, I think are ways that you actually see civil society grow, because there are great intention leaders in the continent that I think that we should be focused on. We should figure out ways that the U.S. has similar interests there. We've invested a lot of money into our ports here domestically, and so I think that's something that we should focus in on, and something that we don't focus in on enough, in my opinion.
I think you are onto something very important there about mutual interests, because, like we said from the get-go, it seems as if the strategy is geared more towards, like Mahi said, it's about there is a response, isn't it? And then it's a response that is meant to use Africa as a leverage towards American interests. But I think that the coinage there of mutual interest is important. And I'm sure the supporters of Raila Odinga are not very happy with you talking about President-elect Ruto, because, again, I think it's his constitutional right to be able to say the elections, and that is the problem. We always have to hang on to something. And the couple of things there you said, Ruto is a young person and all that. I don't think Raila Odinga will be happy about that. I don't know what's your.
So listen. I don't. When Joe Biden won the election in America, President Trump's people, not all of his people, were happy about it. You could see that come into fruition in January 6th. When you lose an election, and you're not supporting the person who won, it is a natural reaction to be upset about the result. But that is part of it's just like sports. When my team loses a Super Bowl, it's demoralizing, and I don't, I'd say, oh, the refs missed this call, or they missed this call, and that in fact it is something that's the competition part of politics. But really, and that is definitely fine. I think that what should be celebrated, though, is that an election happened, and to result into, oh, this is going to be violent, this is going to be whatever. I don't think that that's necessarily intrinsic within African culture. It's amplified to a certain extent, but I think that that's something that, again, when you focus in on everything that could have gone wrong, or when you focus in on the fact that one person won and one person lost, you weren't going to get two presidents. You were going to get one president, and that's the part of elections. That's the part of that. And so, I'm not saying I'm a supporter of who I support or who I don't support. All I'm saying is the election was called, and we should celebrate the fact that for most part the region for sure came together, and folks across the continent also have acknowledged that. And for the most part, he has his constitutional right to be able to say, hey, I want to recount whatever. I mean, that happened in 2000 with Gore and Bush. That happened in this past election too. And no one is saying that's not their right to do it. It is their right to do it. But I think that it should be celebrated that an election happened. Neighboring countries and folks across the continent acknowledged it and congratulated that. And I think that that's something that we want to overlook and not talk enough about. And I think that's a mistake, always being so critical and never celebrating the wins and looking things at a positive light on the continent. I think it's detrimental to U.S.-Africa foreign policy and at large.
So to Bo's point, Mahi, do you suggest the U.S. should follow what China is doing? Because China has a huge influence on the continent because they are not giving those preconditions, isn't it? They are not looking at the fact that, oh, this country is ruled by a dictator, so we cannot. I think Bo is suggesting that, yes, do not overlook that, but do not overemphasize that to the detriment of doing something that is going to move beyond. So should that be what the example that the U.S. should copy from China?
Actually, the Chinese are very clear about this. What was their policy called? I forget. But they don't engage with politics, right? Like they're more so interested in alliances. And the U.S. has always supported any regime it's wanted to support. Like that has been clear. So I do not I do not want to say that the U.S. should take this approach because it has. It just always there's doublespeak between what the U.S. foreign policy claims it's doing versus what it's really doing. So I don't. It would be foolish, silly of me to say that the U.S. should engage with dictators in Africa or regimes that are not representative of the people and their wishes, because the U.S. does do that, regardless of us sitting here having that conversation. And I don't know, Bo, you mentioned like for example, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, right? Despite what's been happening with the dam, I think Africa right now generates 4% of the electricity in the world, and if the GERD is complete, like it will become the largest hydroelectric plant in Africa, and I believe it the seventh largest in the world. And this not only has the potential to electrify Ethiopia, but like the whole region, right? But when have we seen clear support from the U.S.? The U.S. has played a role in mediating at times, but not once was there clear support to this kind of great way of like really like this would be the one project you would want to support, regardless of whoever regime, whether you support the regime of power or not, the government in power or not. But correct me if I'm wrong, I have not seen any proactive support for a project like this. And when we're talking economic relations with the U.S., we do have economic relations, but seldom are they mutual and seldom are they really, fair. And I think the first objective in this strategy talks about fostering openness and open societies. And I mean, this really is, from what we have seen, the tendency for the U.S. to use alliances as leverage, like economic alliances as leverage against African countries, like structural adjustment programs on the continent and integration of Africa into the global economy, like, for example, demanded by the Washington Consensus and imposed by the donors throughout the 1990s and the 2000s, have largely failed to improve the living conditions of the majority of Africans. So we would be wise to remember that even when the GDP numbers did rise in Africa, they were often paired with increasing poverty and precarious working conditions. So really, what are we aspiring towards, and what aspect of U.S. relations with any form of government in Africa has been useful is something I want to interrogate. Not to mention, we have to have a conversation about this very blatant difference between the U.S. approach to Africa and the Chinese approach to Africa, which is the U.S. Military Command for Africa, AFRICOM, which maintains about 29 bases in 15 different countries. And so, and this is in the name of counterinsurgency, but really, since AFRICOM was founded in 2007, violence and instability has only increased on the continent. So, is Africa really a market for U.S. arms, and is the presence of U.S. forces on African continent more for Africa, or is it for the U.S. and to ensure the U.S.'s interests, which it has not been shy about? So the part that I am lost on is this idea of mutual. And this is not to say we haven't had great initiatives from the side of the U.S. people, but this is to underline that the U.S. foreign policy towards Africa has been very predatory.
So, I'll respond by saying this. I think again, like I mentioned when I first, when we first started, is that this is an opportunity to engage the diaspora in a way that hasn't been engaged before. They have keen interest on the continent. We see that DFC, along with the trip that Secretary Blinken took, DFC announced multiple investments and infrastructure projects, in broadband projects and agriculture projects, to provide in partnership with some countries in Africa. And I think that this model of really engaging the diaspora can allow for, because the diaspora does see these wins. The diaspora does see the benefit of the GERD. The diaspora does see the opportunity of trade between ports, between the port of the Red Sea and the ports all across the east coast of this country. And I think that there is an opportunity to engage the diaspora in a way that they haven't been engaged before. I think that this administration, keenly has realized this to some extent. And members of Congress have also, and politicians on the state, local, and federal level have also realized this as well. And I think that that's something that we should, as a diaspora, harness this moment in time, because we really do want what's best for the U.S., being residents and constituents and citizens of this country, and also have an interest of wanting to make sure that we're promoting an emerging market that will be 25% of the world's population by 2050. I think that that's something that there is a mutual interest that needs to be recognized and realized. And I think that the diaspora is keenly aware of saying this is of U.S. interest. This is of, whether that be Nigeria or Ghana or South Africa or Kenya or Uganda or Ethiopia interests. And how can we merge these two together to ultimately see folks in? I think that if you talk to any diaspora person, what they would want is jobs for folks in on the continent. And how do we harness the small business owners, the entrepreneurs, the teachers, the doctors who are in this country to make sure that we're partnering and figuring out a way to authentically partner there? And I'm not saying that we should take the China model. I'm saying that it's a both and. It's a, hey, let's recognize where we can work together and show these areas of where we can work together as places to where we can grow together. And I think that if we expect growth and expectations of things and want to point out the bad things, we'll never really fully realize what's possible in a U.S. Africa foreign policy strategy. I think that the diaspora is aware of that. I think the diaspora is pushing for that, and I think the Biden administration, by including that, is trying to focus to some extent to that. But I would say that it needs to take definitely a leadership role to be able to do that.
Okay, so Bo, let me come back to you in a minute and just ask you a direct question in terms of within the confines of Pan-Africanism, where do you find bilateral trade being beneficial? Shouldn't we go? I mean, we just established African free continental free trade area, and shouldn't that be the move for the continent? That continental free trade area, shouldn't that be the support? And issues of bilateral trade relations would maybe again take away from that. How am I wrong?
So I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. I think that you can do regional integration. You see the East African community, um, uh, doing doing trade deals within Kenya to Uganda, or Tanzania to Burundi, and I think that those things are very beneficial because there are a lot of commodities and goods and services that African countries should be able to be integrating and trading within themselves. There are some countries that have economies of scale and critical minerals and resources that some other industrialized nations need. And I think that if you want to the ability to be able to partner and to form allies across the world is something that I don't think that any African country should restrict itself from. And I think that that's also something that African countries have realized. There are a lot of people who want to partner with them, um, and I agree that AFCFTA is one of the is a very important way to integrate economies and create economies of scale within all of Africa, all 54 countries. And I think that's very important. I also think that there's ways to partner that I think that can be realized through bilateral relations, which actually have never, a U.S. Kenya trade deal will be the first one of its kind. And so I think that you've seen it work for other countries, whether that be Japan or South Korea or India or any other emerging market. And I think that it could work well for countries in Africa as they look to trade deals within the U.S. And I don't think that that precludes them from trading within the African continent.
So, Mai, let's again. You teased out something there when you made a comment about AFRICOM, and that was kind of hilarious listening to that. Are you advocating for AFRICOM to be taken out completely from? Don't you think they have a role to play, even though the results do not match the rhetoric?
Um, Honestly, Lambert, I think if anything, where we are in the world right now shows us like demilitarization should be at the top of our priorities in any policy, whether it's national or international. Whether you're looking at the war between Russia and Ukraine, whether you're looking at what's happening on the continent, whether you're looking at the fact that armed groups and insurgency has basically proliferated, whether you're looking at the NATO intervention in Libya and where Libya is now today. I really not only Africa, but I would call for demilitarization at all levels, because one thing that we have seen is that violence reproduces itself. So I do not think that you can fight fire with fire. I do not think, actually, not only do I not think, but the last 2 decades at the very least have shown us that you cannot. That to combat terrorism, to combat Al Shabaab, to combat Boko Haram, you are going to need a comprehensive strategy. Throwing guns and weapons and violence at it will not solve it. In fact, it will only increase it. And we have seen the counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. We have seen these things play out in different ways. So I would ask that we stop and think about what is another strategy we need to consider, because we've also seen what the current strategies that are being called for have taken us. So it wouldn't take a lot for us to imagine what will happen on the continent, what is happening really. Look at West Africa, and the strategy itself talks about military coups in that's happened over the last year. But my question is, how did those military coups happen, right? What were they a response to? How are the people of West Africa struggling with armed groups? And how has, like, the fact that French forces have been coming in, Russian mercenaries have been coming in, US has been aiding, and how has that stopped any of it really? So I think it's time to rethink and reevaluate what strategy would take us out of violence and would move us towards reconciliation, towards peace. So yes, I do think the removal of AFRICOM is essential from the continent. I think, do we need to phase it out? Perhaps. I am not a military strategist, so I can't speak much to it. So, but I will say that their removal is essential.
I will also flag and say that the AFRICOM base is actually not on the continent. It's actually located in Stuttgart, Germany. And I know there's been a lot of, how can you really partner from a military basis if the headquarters for AFRICOM is actually not on the continent? And I think that's the mutual partnership that these African countries are actually looking for. If we're going to partner together on something, what are the ways that you're showing we're going to partner together? China does through the China Belt and Road Initiative, but I think that there is definitely ways. How can we focus and prioritize American interests when it comes to U.S. Africa foreign policy, and how can we signal that it's a true partnership? A headquarters for your command base that's not in the United States, or that's not on the continent, is something that I think that African countries have called for, and also folks across the diaspora. I know that there are plenty of amendments that have been brought up asking for that study, and so I know that that's something that folks in DC have talked about, and I think that's something that both the diaspora and African countries are looking for when it comes to a true partnership.
Allow me to
So,
respond, Lambert.
absolutely, go ahead.
Okay, so Bo, yes, the headquarters are not, but AFRICOM is currently running about 29 bases, and this is as of 2019 on the continent. So there are military bases on the continent that are controlled by AFRICOM itself. And there is this question of, for example, and a lot of people, Horace Campbell has written on this, Samar al-Balushi. There's this question of what happens when, for example, you have the East African Counterterrorism Initiative, right? And this was an initiative by President Bush. And this initiative, really, once the U.S. left Somalia in 1993, it wanted forces to keep its interest and to counter terrorism in that region. And what it did was it paid money to countries that were willing to support groups. And I believe Kenya got about 88 million. So what happens when you're monetizing defense, right? What happens, like, where does the need to manufacture terrorism itself stop, when we know we have regimes that are not fully trustable, when we know there are different interests from different groups on the ground? What happens when you are monetizing these things, right? And when you really have no control over them? So I would kind of push back. I do agree with you that, like, mutual partnership on security is important, but I would say that AFRICOM, really, it has nothing to do with African interests. It has everything to do with American interests, but particularly U.S. state interests.
Yeah, every military base that's headquartered in any region obviously is forefront of American interests, and in the same way that when other countries put bases on the continent is for their strategic countries' domestic issues, and you've seen a lot of folks in the Indo-Pacific being putting bases in African countries. Like my point was more of, when I think we miss the mark when we don't focus in on what these leaders of Africa mean when they say they want a true partnership. It's very indicative from an African leader's perspective of when, whether that's seeing what the South African president said post Secretary Blinken's trip, or listening to African diaspora folks in the community here domestically. A signal of a true partnership isn't plopping something down or saying, doing. It's really, how are we building something together? What are our interests? What are our shared interests, and how are we partnering together? And I think that security issues are issues that both African countries and the U.S. have and want to address together. My kind of focus would be on saying, what are the areas of mutual interest? How can we build those together? And how can we build upon and current existing models to make sure that we're shifting things to actually benefit U.S. Africa partnerships? And that's, I think, how we'll get to a firm and strategic U.S.-Africa policy, which I would assume is the point of having of the Biden administration releasing this strategy out.
So I think we have talked a lot about a series of things, and one point that has come up very much is about the diaspora. But one aspect, the economic aspect that we have not been able to address is the debt. Because I think debt is also a security issue, and that's also as a result of China, isn't it? China has, many of these African countries, and the relationship has not been easy. Zambia is currently struggling with how to, repurpose their debt with China, and I think it's a cry for concern economically. I want to be respectful of your time because, again, we promised ourselves an hour. So, if you may, are there issues that you would have loved to find in the strategy? I mean, by every stretch, there are many things you have talked about, but if there are 2 or 3 things that you would have loved to find in the strategy that you don't see enough emphasis on, roll on, Mai.
Yes, I think I apologize, Bo. I didn't see you. But I would have loved to see, instead of the U.S. attempting to make African countries and African governments accountable, I would have loved to see the U.S. itself be accountable for its role and its relations on the continent. Right? I think that would have made me very happy to really rethink relations with Africa and come up with a 21st century strategy. I think the U.S. needs to be accountable for its actions and to really stop doublespeak and stop like these saying one thing and doing another, and really just acknowledging what kind of true, like Bo said, like what kind of mutual relations can we build. This is a new world, and I would have loved to see the strategy recognize that.
So, if I may, just before you bounce off, what does that mean when you talked about accountability? Are you talking about repatriation? What is it? What is it in concrete terms? Let me put it that way. What does that take?
Yes, definitely. Reparations is one. The fact that the when we support democracies on the continent, we need to be supporting internal democracies. If we are talking about the African diaspora, the question of what is the U.S. government doing for the African diaspora within to protect and ensure that their rights are maintained, to discuss the basic fact that economic relations so far has not been based on building infrastructure in Africa and making sure that progress is intact, but really about just keeping the individual interest of the U.S. state. So like anything basically, but some form of accountability that would have made us recognize this is really a 21st century strategy. This is not just another form of U.S. foreign policy like the Washington Consensus, like those before it, that is very paternalistic and really not so useful for the continent's people.
So I want to thank both of you, but Bo, let's get. I mean, is there anything you find in the strategy? I mean, something that you would have loved to be in that is not there, but I think already I can see you are very supportive of the strategy. And I'm, without even talking to both of you, I see one person who, Mahi is completely, this thing is, completely out of the window, but you have at least the African diaspora there. That's one aspect. Are there other aspects that you would have loved to find and to put into the strategy, or beyond the diaspora, what else are you celebrating? And after that, I'll just take last comments from you guys.
Yeah, and I think that this is an opportunity to refocus what actual mutual partnership between U.S. and Africa look like. And I particularly believe that this is a moment in time and an inflection point to have the diaspora lead that conversation. I think that you won't get a U.S. Africa policy that comes into fruition the way that we want it to if it's not diaspora led. And so that's the first thing. And I think that it's good to see it in the strategy. My hope is that it takes a larger leadership role than the subsection it's in. The second thing is I think, when you look at what those mutual partnerships are, I think that is how to partner on economy with economies of scale, how to invest in the continent in a way that African countries need it, and that's in the U.S. interest as well. And so, um, one thing that wasn't talked about in the strategy, is the looming thing on AGOA, and how to promote bilateral trade deals. A lot of it was talking about how they're going to rely on private sector businesses in partnerships with other businesses to talk about how we can grow some of our small businesses domestically. I think that those things are important. I think that some of the natural rhetoric that might take place when it comes to doing business in Africa. Oh, it's so super complex, or oh, it's X, Y, and Z. And I think that the U.S. government has an opportunity to demystify the complexity behind that, to show the value add. I mean, people are largely in Asia because of the huge market that it has, and the same thing can be said of what the continent currently is and where it will be in 2050 as well in terms of the global population.
Thank you very much, Mahi.
Yeah, I think I agree with what Bo is saying with the role of the African diaspora and its importance. I would love to see folks like Bo connecting with the African American community and other marginalized groups in the U.S. I would love us to see working together more to realize the potential of Africa and the future. And generally, yes, I look forward to more conversations like this that allow us to think through strategies that concern the continent and that concern global African people.
So again, I want to be I'm very grateful. Mahi is coming to us all the way from Dakar in Senegal. She's been very gracious. I want to say thank you. This is a second conversation. We just started this last week, and we're going to have one every week. And if you want to, how to jump in. But I really want to appreciate you. I thank you for your time. Thank you for all you have done and continue to do for the continent. And again, like we said, this is just a starting point. The opportunity is an inflection point, isn't it? So African diaspora should get in. And I think Mai is part of the diaspora because she's studying at Syracuse University. And so all of us should get together and see how to influence and impact this more. Anybody wants to get a last word before we wrap it up?
Thank you, Lambert.
Yeah, thanks, Lambert, and thanks anybody in the diaspora who's looking at this. I encourage you to get involved in your local, state, and federal level. I think that there's a lot of policies that should be pushed that not only help us domestically, but will also increase and make U.S. Africa foreign policy better. And that takes the diaspora really getting involved. And it's possible. It's necessary, and I'm excited to see the diaspora grow in relevance and input to U.S. Africa foreign policy as well. And so, thanks again, Lambert. Thanks, Mike, for having for joining, and looking forward to seeing how the rest of this series goes.
So thank you all very much. And again, like I said, every Wednesday, same time, 6 p.m. And I hope to get better. Again, Bo and Mai, thank you for your time. You're always welcome. I'm sure I'm going to reach out again to see whether we can flesh this out in a better way. Thank you all. Until next week, see you and have a good evening.